Another video in my series of why Jewish apologetics are so bad. This is a video by Rabbi Kelemen. It's a long video, so I'm going to jump to what I consider to be the important parts. I'll let you know when I'm jumping. Here, I'm jumping to minute 11.
We must be empiricists. We must link ourselves to the physical realities, to the evidence. We cannot suck theories out of our thumb. This could be true. That's irrelevant to me. What is in fact true? What do we know for sure is true?
Okay, I mean, that sounds good, although in general you're never going to know the exact truth of events that happened 3,000 years ago. You can just try to find the most probable account, but continue. I do like the passion for truth. Let's see how long you can keep it up.
One thing we know for sure is true. There's a book.
Okay, today there is a book. When it became a book is an open question, but go on.
And that book tells a story from the second through the fifth chapter, the second through the fifth book of the 5 books of Moses, tells a story about 3 million people hearing God speak. That means at some point, some charismatic cult leader or group of leaders must have told somebody or written down that this event happened, this mass revelation.
I'm not sure why it would have to be a charismatic cult leader rather than, say, a king's scribe or a despised prophet, but okay, yes, if you have something written, then at some point some person wrote it. They didn't have AI back then, so I'm with you so far.
When the charismatic cult leader first introduced to the world this event of Sinai, 3 million people hearing God say, "I'm the Lord your God, you should know other gods before me."
Well, why do you assume it happened that way? Why not assume that many of the elements were already in place? Let's say God calling Moses up on a mountain, like Exodus 20:21, to get some instruction, like Exodus 29, the people seeing the lightning and thunder and being afraid to hear God's voice, like Exodus 20:15-16. But then someone figures that the people must have heard something more interesting, not just the sound and light show, since they were right there, and since this was supposed to make them trust in Moses, they must have heard God's voice as well. That's basically the innovation the author of Deuteronomy makes. So there was no charismatic cult leader. I'm not sure why you need to invent that. There was just a gap in the mythology that someone felt the need to fill in, and did. If you're at all familiar with rabbinical midrash, that's basically what it's always doing, finding a gap and sticking a story element to fill it. These new midrashic myths can never enter the biblical canon at this point. They came too late for inclusion in a written work. But some of them are actually better known among Jews than the actual biblical narrative. For example, everyone who went to a Jewish day school knows that Moses' speech impairment was due to putting a hot coal in his mouth as an infant. The story fills a gap in Moses' biography and provides a missing explanation for Moses' speech defect. It's a midrash, but it's well accepted, and it's easy to imagine that if we were to make a new canonical Bible today, that midrash might find its way into the Moses narratives. A lot of Jews today probably think that it's actually in there already, and they have easy access to the written work. Imagine an era when no one except professional scribes could read or write. Anyway, the adjusted myth about Sinai being a public communication was accepted because it was reasonable and well-liked at the time. Or maybe it even wasn't accepted at the time because no one except certain elites could read and write anyway, so maybe it never percolated down to the masses until long after it was sacred scripture already and was not open for debate. We don't know. As I said, we can only look for what's plausible. The charismatic leader selling the entirety of the tradition in one fell swoop doesn't seem as plausible. Although it's possible. If you look at the story of the lost scroll in 2 Kings, you can see that the author there is not bothered by the idea of King Josiah basically decreeing a new religion for the residents of Judah. No one objects, as far as we're told, except maybe the idolatrous priests he massacred, and not surprisingly, we don't have their accounts. So I think we can hold off on the charismatic leader part, And if we just go with what we know as being true, as Rabbi Kelemen proposes, then we're still just at, we have a book, so someone wrote it. Let's continue.
Where did the charismatic cult leader place this event in history? In other words, come with me back 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 50,000 years ago, whenever you want to say Judaism started. Let's go back to the moment where the charismatic cult leader, in this case played by Kelemen, will persuade the wild-eyed charismatic cult followers, yes, that's you, right, that the whole thing is true. How did it happen? So there's only three possibilities, my thesis says. There's the past theory, the present theory, and the future theory.
Maybe this is interesting for some people, but Rabbi Kelemen is going to rule out the present and future theory, and since I think the past theory is the winner anyway, I'll jump forward in his video to that part. I also kind of hate the way he introduces named theories and theorems as though these are standard scholarly terms when they are just something he made up himself. That's not really cool. Either he should attribute them appropriately, or he should say, I just made this up because I find it handy. Either way would be honest, but not the way he's doing it here. It gives a veneer of scholarship to his lecture that is not really warranted. Anyway, past theory, as Rabbi Kelemen puts it, is just that the tradition, when it is introduced, is already discussing alleged events that are long in the past. I mean, I think this is the way a lot of mythology works, although not all, so let's just go with that rather than debating the other approaches, and we'll just concede to Rabbi Kelemen that they don't really work very well. So let's skip to minute 29.
At every major university in the world today, they're teaching that the Torah is written by man, not by God. And what they teach is past theory. And past theory is really very powerful. A charismatic cult leader made up a whole history.
Well, not necessarily a whole history, and maybe not even more than just putting two and two together, like I said before. Remember, we are not asking in general how an untrue myth could get started. Obviously, untrue myths get started all the time. World mythology is full of untrue myths. So we don't need to explain how myths about God or Moses or a mountain got started any more than we need to explain how myths about Hercules or Maui or Tiamat got started. That's certainly an interesting topic. Why and how do humans make myths? But that's not the topic Rabbi Kelemen is discussing. We can simply accept that the ancient Israelites had myths, just like all ancient peoples had myths. The problem that Rabbi Kelemen sees as uniquely requiring explanation is how a myth of mass revelation could get started. And like I said, if you have a bunch of these other unobjectionable myths already in place, all the innovator might need to do is add a few words into existing tradition that has already been fully accepted. And everybody saw it. Bang. Mass revelation. Now, why would the innovator, let's not call them a cult leader since that's quite a loaded term, why would they do this? Well, myths change and shift all the time. The Bible alone has several incompatible versions of the Revelation myth, so it might have just been a natural shift that happens when people relate narratives to each other, which is how these stories were first shared. Not in writing, but just word of mouth. Perhaps some teacher of children thought that this was the correct version of the teaching and imparted it to thousands of children. It actually makes a more compelling version of the myth, so it probably had sticking power. Like every Jewish apologist in all the other videos I've reviewed assures us, mass revelation is an extremely likable narrative, the best you could possibly come up with. Or the revelation tradition may have started from someone taking a sensible interpolation, like I said before. Of course all the people heard God's voice. They were standing at the foot of the mountain. How could they not hear God's voice? And an element like this might be incredibly important to a diaspora community such as in the Babylonian exile, where the entire edifice of the religion has been lost. The priests, gone. The Holy Land, gone. The temple, gone. The sacrifices, gone. This would be the perfect moment to make that connection. Before there was the temple, before there were priests, before there was the land, we stood together at Sinai and God spoke directly to us. So we don't need those things. We only need God. God wants us to seek Him from wherever we are, and we will find Him if we search with our heart and our soul. When we are in distress because all these things have befallen us, in the end, we must simply return to and listen to our God. That last part, by the way, is Deuteronomy 4:29-30, which was probably composed during the exile. Or the Revelation tradition might have been an effort to reconcile different narratives of the Sinai event. For example, Exodus 19:9 has God saying to Moses, "I will come to you in a thick cloud in order that the people may hear when I speak with you and so trust you ever after." But Exodus 20:16 makes it sound like the Israelites never do hear God speak since they are afraid. "You speak to us," they said to Moses, "and we will obey, but let not God speak to us, lest we die." Between these two traditions, there is no mass revelation. There is a promise of revelation, but no fulfillment of revelation. So a reconciler, rather than a cult leader, may have said, "That can't be right," and produced a kind of synthesis like we see in Deuteronomy, where the Israelites hear just some of God's words, just enough to fulfill the promise and to trust Moses to be responsible to handle the rest of it. Point is that Rabbi Kelemen is trying to get us to imagine some Rasputin who is trying to convince people of some set of ideas that is entirely opposed to everything they know. That is almost certainly an erroneous picture. So again, like Rabbi Kelemen said, let's stick to what we know. Someone made the myth. Other than that, it's pretty much speculation.
He made up a story that there was once a charismatic leader by the name of Moses, and once upon a time the Jews arrived at Mount Sinai. And there they all accepted the Torah and the whole thing was up and running. But then it was lost, and for generations no one knew about it. Until this charismatic cult leader, who actually made up the cult in the first place, quote unquote, relaunched the religion.
Well, kind of sounds like King Josiah or Nehemiah rather than a cult leader, but let's see where he's going with this.
It's a very powerful theory, and there's one small problem with it, and that's this. I ran an experiment several years ago. I went to a great sage in Jerusalem. He passed away now, but his name was Rabbi Shlomo Volba, and I asked him, "The Torah that you're teaching all these thousands of people, where did you get it?" He said, "I got it from my teacher." What was his name? Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz of Mir. I checked. I found 4 independent literary sources confirming a teacher-student relationship. I got birth dates and death dates. I went back to him. "Your teacher's teacher, who was that? Where did Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz get this whole story?" And he said he got it from his teacher, Reb Simcha Zissel Ziv of Kelm. I checked. 4 independent sources, birth dates, death dates. Where did Reb Simcha Zissel Ziv get it? He got it from Rav Yisrael Salant, or Rav Israel of Salant. Birth dates, death dates, 4 independent literary sources. And Israel Salanter from Rav Zundel of Salant. And Rav Zundel of Salant from Rav Chaim of Volozhin. Rav Chaim Volozhin from the Vilna Gaon. And the Vilna Gaon, and I played this game going backwards. It took me 2.5 years to run the experiment. After 2.5 years, I had assembled 4 independent literary sources for every post-biblical name in the chain.
Intriguing, although I'm not sure where he's drawing the biblical line. Is he saying that he has 4 independent sources going all the way back to the Second Temple? That's interesting, although I don't see how it bears much on this discussion, since it's agreed, so far as I know, that the Sinai narrative would have been canonical by that point. To get interesting, we have to go back 400 to 800 years more. How will he do this, I wonder?
You can find it on the web. It's very famous now. I established a training tradition that goes from me back to Moses at Mount Sinai.
This is exactly where my bullshit detector starts going off like crazy. Okay, if I understood you correctly, you just said you had 4 independent sources testifying that each person in your list was told about the revelation at Sinai from the previous person on the list. I mean, that's certainly believable in the post-biblical period since there's been a canonical written source all that time, the Masoretic text of the Bible. So as long as everyone's been reading more or less the same Bible, yeah, everyone's been getting the same story. It's an entirely garbled and incomprehensible story, but it's the same words in more or less the same order. But now you say you trace this intellectual transmission, teacher to student, with 4 independent sources, all the way back to a mythical person and a mythical event? I say bullshit. Prove me wrong. Let's look at your list. I found this version online. I hope it's the correct one. You've got Amos and then Isaiah. So, prove to me, using 4 sources, or even 1 source, that Amos told Isaiah the story of the revelation at Sinai. They don't mention Sinai in their writings or mention each other, so I'm going to politely call this complete conjecture. How much of the rest of this list is conjecture too? You said before that we must be empiricists. We can only discuss what's true.
We must be empiricists. We must link ourselves to the physical realities, to the evidence. We cannot suck theories out of our thumb. This could be true. That's irrelevant to me. What is in fact true? What do we know for sure is true?
So what exactly is empirical or true about this list? If you abandoned empiricism and truth at some point, I think you should have informed us when you did that.
It's 60-some generations. Now, I'm not telling you anything on that sheet is true. I'm telling you something far more powerful.
Well, I wish you would start with true. I mean, what's Pinchas doing hanging out here for 300 years? Is that the result of your empirical method?
I have all those books on my shelves.
What books do you have before the Dead Sea Scrolls? I'd love to see your library.
And what I'm telling you is, that chain is what Jews believe.
No. Telling me what someone believes is not more powerful than telling me what is true. The title of your talk is, How Do You Know the Torah is True? It's not how do you know the Torah is believed. Really, it's only the true part that I care about. People believe lots of things, and I don't care.
That's what they claim. What's the problem? They're claiming that there is a continuous, unbroken chain from today going straight back to Sinai. Why is that problematic?
Well, I can think of a lot of reasons, but you just told me you spent 2.5 years working on it, so do you also think it's complete bullshit? I mean, I know you're trying to give an entertaining seminar, but will you not just tell me how I know the Torah is true? You have 10 minutes left in your class. Hi, this is me popping in from the future. I didn't really think much about Rabbi Kelemen's list when making this video, because it's obviously ridiculous, but I thought of a few more things I want to say about it. You can find that at the end of this video. Thanks.
Go back to past theory. In past theory, charismatic cult leader comes to you and says, there was Moses, there was a gap, and there was Fred, MGF. If I persuade all of you, Moses, gap, Fred, MGF, what do you tell your kids? MGF. What do they tell their kids? MGF. And you have generation after generation talking about Moses, then a gap, and then Fred. And yet, when we start looking at Jewish communities and their histories, we find no record ever of a significant gap in Jewish history.
You're moving the goalposts. Let's not do that. The gap you were talking about is not a gap in history, but a gap in knowledge about a certain event. There's a difference between saying there's a gap in the knowledge of how to make pizza and there's a gap in the history of Italy. You can have a continuous history of Italy and also have a gap of knowledge in how to make a good pizza. So let's stick to exactly what we were talking about, which is the continuous transmission of a very particular set of beliefs and the evidence for that transmission. But why are we looking for a gap at all? The gap is just part of the story that Fred is telling, right? Fred is saying to his crazy followers that their ancestors used to believe something and they should resume believing that something. When did their ancestors stop believing? Let's say 500 years earlier. So what does Rabbi Kelemen imagine that Fred's followers would be looking for? They have no written history, and they can't read anyway. Why would they be looking for a gap? They are in the gap. They are the gap. All they have ever known is the gap. It's not we here on YouTube who need to look for a gap. We just need to consider how Fred's followers would have received his new information. He told them that their distant ancestors dropped the ball. That's the only information they have. He's charismatic, so they believe him. What else would they go looking for, and where would they look? Rabbi Kelemen is just making a mess of this whole story.
A period where people couldn't ask their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents and hear about the word Sinai.
I thought we were talking about teacher-to-student transmission, not parent-to-child. The idea behind your Sinai list was teacher-to-student relationship, right? When did we switch? Anyway, okay, it's safe to say that everyone has biological parents, so there is the possibility in most cases that you heard something or other from your parents unless you're an orphan. Fair enough. But we are trying to establish that you heard a very particular thing from your parents or teachers. That is why you're giving this lecture. So yeah, people keep being born, so there is that kind of continuity. But if you're looking for traumatic upheavals and social dislocations that could result in an intellectual shift of one kind or another, the history of Judaism is full of those. Exactly what kind of discontinuity would Rabbi Kelemen be satisfied with in order to say that a new tradition could form then? Does he require Jews to literally stop producing babies for 100 years and then somehow resume producing babies? That's the only gap that Rabbi Kelemen would accept? A simple exile or civilizational collapse is not enough? I think that's a pretty absurd standard. Anyway, he has 9 minutes left.
It's a continuous line. Where is the gap in Jewish history?
I don't care because that's not the topic of your talk, and Fred's followers don't care either. So let's get back to proving the Torah is true.
And even worse.
Worse than what?
Where's Fred?
Fred, as we recall, in Rabbi Kelemen's thinking, is the charismatic cult leader who makes up the tradition out of whole cloth and foists it upon his gullible cult followers, and I've suggested that if you did want to find somebody who kind of fit that model, who we actually have a record of, you would probably look at King Josiah or a couple hundred years later at Nehemiah, the governor of Judah. Both of these individuals claim that in their time, the people did not know God's laws, and then they revealed to the people a scroll of Torah that the people were not previously aware of. That is all entirely clear in the text of the Bible. You can go and read it right now. And the fact that we have these stories suggests that a similar kind of event could have happened on other occasions. The formula is, this is the teaching of Moses that your ancestors forgot. And bingo. But I also said that you really don't need to go looking for a charismatic cult leader at all. You don't need to find Fred. All you need is for some anonymous schoolteacher to slightly tweak an existing mythology, and off you go. Take the stories of the demigod Maui. They include that he pulled islands out of the sea, captured the sun, gave humans fire, held up the sky, and so on. You know the song, "You're Welcome." Do we imagine that a single person named Fred invented Maui and all of these myths in one sitting and then traveled around Polynesia sharing his new mythology with everyone? No. These myths just accreted over time. All you need is some teacher of small children to say, Maui also held up the sky, and you are off and running. But whatever, Rabbi Kelemen really likes the Fred idea. If I were going to go Freudian here, I think maybe he recognizes something of himself in Fred, the man trying to pull one over on his devoted followers. Anyway, let's see where he goes. I kind of feel like he's on thin ice at this point. He seems to be relying on the idea of a Fred, and the idea that we need to be able to find a broken genealogical or civilizational record to explain how Fred's followers could accept his story. Very dubious.
I spoke at Yale a few weeks ago. When I spoke, I asked a group of students there with degrees, advanced degrees, Jewish studies. I asked them, tell me something.
I always hate when speakers start relating these encounters with previous audiences. They almost always sound fictionalized to me, and just a delay tactic. Why not just make your point? How do I know the Torah is true?
What was the name of the man who went up on the mountain, got the Torah, and brought it down? So a few of them called out, that's easy, Moses. I said, okay, you might earn a PhD. Right now you're up to a BA. Let me ask you a tougher question. When the Jews were abandoned by Moses, Moses died, and the Jews had to go into the land of Israel, who took them in? And a bunch of people confidently said, that was Joshua. I said, I see you know Jewish history. Let me ask you a tougher question. The Jews were in Babylon, and there they were redeemed, and they came back to the land of Israel. Who was the great leader who brought the Jews back to the land of Israel? And a bunch of people cried out, that was Ezra. We all know that was Ezra.
Well, we are told Ezra was a member of one of the later waves of immigration, and he is quite a mysterious figure, but fine, let's see where we are going. 8 minutes left.
Who redacted the Mishnah? Someone cried out, Judah the Prince, Yehuda Nasi. Who redacted the Talmud? Ravina and Ravashi. I asked them, how do you know all these names? The answer, these are the most famous people in all of Jewish history. We know of their accomplishments. They're written up in every Jewish book. Then I turned to 4 biblical critics who were standing on the dais with me, and I asked them, gentlemen, can you please tell me, who is Fred? And one man confidently stood up and he said, Fred is Chizkiyahu. And the fellow standing next to him said, it can't be Chizkiyahu, it's Yirmiyahu. This guy says, it can't be Yirmiyahu, it's Ezra. This guy says, it can't be Ezra. And you just stand back and they kill each other. Now, why are they arguing?
Because events from 2,500 years ago are difficult to determine, and we only have a single piece of literary evidence, if you even want to call it that.
Don't they know? And the answer is because in 24 books of the Bible, in 60 volumes of the Talmud, in dozens of volumes of Medrash, there is not a single word about the greatest crisis ever in Jewish history, a crisis where for generations the Jews knew nothing about Sinai.
I would say that virtually the entire Bible is testimony of the crisis. When you read through the books of the prophets, who are the Jews worshiping? It's never Yahweh, the God of the Jews. It's always Baal or Asherah or Molech or other deities of the Canaanite pantheon. The Jews are never practicing Judaism or teaching the worship of Yahweh, so why would you think they'd be transmitting traditions about Yahweh's revelation? When you read the Bible, you are reading about the crisis in the worship of Yahweh that the prophets are constantly trying to resolve by reminding the Jews of their distant history with their God, Yahweh. The section of the Bible called the prophets could just as well have been called the crisis in Jewish belief, or the gap in Jewish belief. Basically, the prophets are trying, and mostly failing, so it seems, to do exactly what Rabbi Kelemen imagines Fred doing. They are telling the Jews that their ancestors made a covenant with Yahweh, that they were saved from Egypt by Yahweh, and it's time that they better start worshiping Yahweh already. If this is not the picture you get when you read the prophets, I don't know what books you are reading. It's pretty plain. And if you want to focus it down more, then sure. In 2 Kings and the book of Nehemiah, it makes very clear that the Jews are not worshiping Yahweh. In 2 Kings, during the beginning of the reign of Josiah, the priests are actually worshiping Baal and Asherah in the temple in Jerusalem, and this is not the first time we're told this, so there is no Judaism going on there at all. And this situation has persisted for generations, we are told. Josiah's scribe produces a scroll that no one has ever seen before, containing instructions that no one has ever seen before, that says that they have lost the traditions that their distant ancestors had relating to Yahweh, and they better start doing them right now or they can expect severe punishment. So if you really want to find Fred, you can find Fred, but I think the scholarly disagreement is reasonable because we only have the one source. But back to the crisis in which the Jews don't know about Sinai, I bring you back to the prophets. In all those pages where the prophets are haranguing Israel for their infidelity to Yahweh and for failing to remember all the things he has done for them, how many times do they mention the revelation at Sinai or Horeb? Never. Not at all. So, was there a crisis during which the Jews knew nothing about Sinai? Yes. Yes, there was. It was most of Jewish history up until sometime during or after the Babylonian exile, and it's obvious. As far as we can tell, there was no Sinai tradition. You, Rabbi Kelemen, have 7 minutes left to convince me of something.
After the Holocaust, everyone who walked out of the Holocaust knew about the word Sinai. They either believed it or they denied it. But everyone knew about Sinai. This is a crisis of such proportions that nobody knew about it. How could that be?
How could that be? Because the tradition did not exist. What do you mean, how could that be?
And how could that crisis not be recorded in Jewish history? And how could the leader who restarted Judaism be unknown?
Well, like I said, the crisis is as plain as day. You just have your eyes closed, unfortunately. As far as the resolution to the crisis, that is less clear, but Josiah and Nehemiah remain candidates, and they are known. Certainly the evidence that the tradition of Sinai started in those generations around the Babylonian exile is much stronger than that the tradition was known prior to exile, for which there is little or nothing. Even if you view the account in Exodus as being earlier, which is not the scholarly view, it really doesn't say that the people ever heard God speak. They just got a sound and light show.
Small problem with past theory is where's the gap and where's Fred?
And the reason it's not a problem is that you don't need a genealogical gap. And if you are looking for an intellectual gap, which you also don't need, the Bible testifies to that intellectual gap beyond amply. The books of the prophets are the works that tell us about the gap. And from the standpoint of Fred's followers, you don't need that gap at all. They just need to believe Fred that they are currently in the gap. And you don't need a Fred, but if you are looking for one, Josiah and Nehemiah remain candidates, and I'm sure there are others as well. We can't say for certain because it's 2,500 years ago. But it's a lot more plausible than a revelation of God at Sinai. You have 6 minutes left to convince me that the past theory is not viable.
End of part 3. Past, present, and future could not have launched Judaism. That means Judaism must be true. God must have spoken to Jews at Mount Sinai.
Nope. You did not convince me that past theory cannot be correct. Every myth has some origin in a human mind. Primitive minds in every culture are full of myths. You needed to show that a myth of revelation at Sinai could not also have been created by a human mind, just like every other myth we know of. You did not do that. Based on the fact that Jews for most of their biblical history were not worshippers of Yahweh and are constantly being told to follow a teaching and a God that their ancestors forgot, and that we scarcely see a mention of revelation at Sinai until after the Babylonian exile, I conclude that the past theory is indeed correct. Fred or no Fred, at some point around the Babylonian exile, the idea of a national revelation at Sinai was introduced, probably just by extending some existing mythology a little bit, and any doubters were reassured that this was all known to their distant ancestors, but forgotten. You have not done anything to convince me otherwise, and in fact, your presentation of the chain of tradition from Sinai and constant goalpost shifting has led me to doubt whether in fact you are going about this in an intellectually honest way to begin with.
Go to the last part, part 4.
Well, you failed at part 3, but you said part 4 is independent, so let's go.
Very quickly. Every single person in this room believes natural things happen more than once. That's the backbone of scientific theory, and there's a good reason for believing that. Because there's only 4 natural forces in the world. There's gravity, electromagnetism, the nuclear strong force, and the nuclear weak force.
Oh boy, where is this going now?
Those 4 forces never change their strengths. And there's matter and energy never changes. It never goes away. It can be matter, can become energy can become matter. But it's going to be there forever.
I don't know, do I need to check my particle physics textbook to understand this part? I hope this argument is not based on these premises because I'm not sure I believe what he's saying. I don't think he's a particle physicist, and I'm not either.
That means I can run a scientific experiment, and under the same conditions, I will always get the same result. So if I let go of this pen under these circumstances, it should fall down. Oh, thank God. Okay, now, no matter how many times I repeat that experiment, I'm going to get the same result, unless I put a vacuum above me, in which case, under different circumstances, it might go up with a vacuum. But besides that, it's always going to fall down. Natural things happen more than once.
I don't grant that. What do you consider a natural thing? That seems to be an important thing to establish, but is anything really riding on this? I don't feel like debating it unless it's important, and I don't see how it could be right now.
If it is normal and natural to be able to launch a mythology about mass revelation.
Oh, so natural includes human activities also. Well, in that case, natural things definitely don't need to happen more than once. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings. That's not going to happen again. Where are we going with all this?
It should happen again.
Well, maybe it will, but why do I care? You are trying to convince me that the Torah we have is true, are you not?
And yet, in 5,000 years of comprehensive religious histories, we do not have a single nation, a single group of people, 500 people, 250 people, 100 people, who all claim they heard God speak and lived to talk about it.
Well, that's the Deuteronomy version, not the Exodus version. In the Exodus version, the people just get the sound and light show, and I'm pretty sure you can find some similar large-scale miracles in other religions. I don't really care either way because you need to prove to me that it happened, not that it's a unique claim. Maui pulling islands out of the ocean with a hook also seems like a unique claim. Why do I care?
There's no such thing in human history. It doesn't exist. So someone will say, you know how it happened? It's very easy. When they left Egypt, how much food could they have carried with them? They carried 2 pounds of matzah, and even if you calculate in the constipation factor, how long is that going to last? So after a couple weeks, they were starving, and they came into a field filled with mushrooms, and they started eating these things.
I have never heard anyone say that before. Very creative, Rabbi. Go on.
It was a mass drug trip, yeah? Or it was mass hysteria. They were terrified by a thunderstorm. Or it was an evolving mythology that happened over thousands of years.
Hey, there you go. That sounds good to me. Why don't you try to disprove that idea?
Whatever rational explanation you'll give me, the more probable you make your explanation, the more you say that could easily happen, then the more powerful my question becomes. If it could easily happen, why didn't it ever happen again?
Well, the idea of many people witnessing something miraculous did happen in many different religious traditions. And the idea of many people interacting with gods did also happen in many religious traditions. If you are asking why don't other religious traditions have the exact event described in Deuteronomy, I think you're asking too much. There are unique circumstances that relate to the Jewish experience that are not shared by other cultures. Chief among them is that the Jews were a population among the Canaanites who were worshipping Canaanite gods and needed to be convinced to worship a different god, a certain invisible god named Yahweh. If you are being told that you need to worship an invisible god who doesn't talk to anyone anymore, and that you only know about because he was known to your ancestors in the distant past, you might appreciate a pretty good story of a big reveal, one that also explains why he doesn't talk to anyone anymore. If you are not in that particular situation, that might not be a big concern. You don't need a big story about Maui revealing himself to an entire nation. He just casually shows up here and there and everywhere and does what he wants. So asking why some people in Africa or Tibet didn't come up with this exact mythology is pretty misguided and misleading. They did not have the circumstances that would have made it meaningful or sensible. But again, I don't really care if the claim is unique or not. You are trying to prove that it's true, that it corresponds to reality. Claiming that it's unique is different than proving that it's true. I'm quite sure you realize this. You are a smart guy, or so it would appear, and you have 4 minutes left.
Natural things happen more than once. Is it natural for a group of people to make up a story about God coming down in the form of a human being?
Is it natural? I wouldn't put it that way. I mean, it seems like a common mythological motif. Like it's common to think that demons are giving you headaches. These are common folk beliefs.
I know it's possible naturally to get away with that story. How do I know? It happens dozens of times in human history. Is it possible to get away with a story about how God impregnates a woman who gives birth to a miraculous child? Christianity, the Greek mythologies, happens over and over again. People get away with that story. Whatever lie can be told has been told, except for one, which is the most obvious and most basic lie. God spoke to a group of people. Why hasn't everyone ever come up with that again?
God spoke to a group of people? Well, I'd say people have come up with that idea many times. If you're a Christian and you believe Jesus is God, he certainly spoke to many groups of people. The Pharaoh of Egypt was considered to be a living god and spoke to many people. The Norse god Odin mingles with and speaks to people. And in the Bible, Yahweh speaks casually to many people, aside from the revelation at Sinai. Check Judges 1:2 and 10:11. But again, what are you proving?
No one ever thought of it? It's too complicated? God spoke to 5 people, never thought of that one.
No, they did, just not exactly the version you're imagining. There are many examples in folklore of gods talking to people.
What's going on? Why is that? And if you'll tell me, well, it could happen, but it's extremely unlikely, extremely unlikely.
Yes, most of what you hear in religious mythology is extremely unlikely to rational people.
It's so unlikely it doesn't happen more than once every 5 or 6 or 7,000 years. And the horizon of history drops a black cloth at a certain point, and I can't see that far back in history because the cave paintings fade and the papyri rot. And therefore, even though there was a story about mass revelation 6, 7, 8, 10,000 years ago, but I have no way of seeing it because I can't see that far back in history. If you'll tell me that.
I don't care about all that. I don't care if it's an utterly unique story or not. Prove to me that it actually happened. Do it now. You have 3 minutes left.
I'll say to you, yeah, you really believe that? Let me ask you something. I get up in front of you and I take a pair of dice and I tell you I'm the luckiest guy you ever met. I'm going to throw double sixes on the first throw. And I throw a pair of double sixes. So what are the odds I just got lucky? It's 1 in 36. What are the odds the dice are loaded? 35 and 36. Which do you believe?
You see, when apologists start going off like this is when I really know they don't have the goods. This is all just a distraction. I want Rabbi Kelemen to prove to me that a revelation at Sinai happened in the way that he claims, which I'm guessing is the version in Deuteronomy. Prove to me that 2 million or 3 million people stood at Mount Sinai and heard God speak the 10 Commandments exactly as they are written in Deuteronomy and no more. All we have is the story. I don't care if the story is unique. I don't care if no one else ever thought of such a good story. I don't care if you can trace your intellectual genealogy back to Maimonides or Jesus. I want you to prove to me that this story is true. You now have 2 minutes.
I do better. I pick up the dice. I throw 10 double sixes in a row. The odds of me throwing 10 double sixes in a row are something like 1 in 36 to the 10. That's pretty slim. It's about 1 in 10 to the 15. So now, let's say it's extremely unlikely that someone would get away with a story about mass revelation, and it's extremely unlikely someone would throw 10 double sixes in a row.
The first thing is not extremely unlikely, and the second thing is a distraction.
Let's say that the odds are the same.
Who would say that?
Or if you don't like that, Adjust this number 10 double sixes. Make it 5 double sixes, make it 15 double sixes. I don't really care about the number.
I don't care either. You are supposed to provide evidence that the account of Revelation in Deuteronomy is true, which is what you set out to do and why I'm watching this video to the bitter end.
Take some number of rolls of dice, of double sixes, that's so unlikely it wouldn't happen more than once every 6,000 years. Whatever number you want, I don't care.
If you don't care, then why are we talking about dice?
Now, I show you a video of a man throwing, let's say 10 double sixes in a row. And I tell you, there's a point 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1% chance that he just got lucky. And there's a 99.999999999999999% chance those dice are loaded. What do you believe?
I believe you have 1 minute left and you're going to totally blow it.
If you're calm and rational, it's very obvious. Now just switch to the other side of the chart. I show you a picture of a group of people traveling down through history who believed in mass revelation. Which you said it's so unlikely no one would ever get away with that except for once every 5,000 or 6,000 years, just like the dice. You know what the chances are this happened naturally?
Yeah, I'm with that lady. She realizes that Rabbi Kelemen has given up on trying to prove anything here. She's saying, man, I schlepped myself out here to hear Rabbi Kelemen assure me that my beliefs are well grounded, and now that I've heard him, I'm even more skeptical than before. I'm with you, girl.
0.00000000000000001% chance. And there's a 99.9999999999999% chance this was not a natural event.
You see, after all those numbers, I don't even know what event you're talking about anymore. There was no event. You are trying to convince me there was some event. What are all these 99999s supposed to do for me? You have 40 seconds.
Put aside all emotional biases and tell me what you think is rational.
Well, sure. Although I think you should put aside your emotional biases as well, which you clearly have not. What I think is rational is that the Israelite people had a set of myths that involve the God Yahweh speaking to various people at various times, such as patriarchs and prophets. I think there was a tradition that the Israelites came from Egypt and wandered in the wilderness. Probably many variations on this tradition. Probably some tradition about Moses and Aaron and variations on that. Probably some tradition of law-giving in the wilderness and variations on that, involving Moses as the lawgiver. That's kind of the sense of the traditions you get from reading the prophets. Probably some tradition about a holy mountain as well. At some point, various myths merge together, and Moses the lawgiver gets the law on the holy mountain, and at some point after that, someone introduces the idea that everyone saw it. That's what seems reasonable to me based on where and when Sinai is mentioned in the Bible. And I would say that the last step occurred during or after the Babylonian exile because that's when we see it come out in full force in Deuteronomy. That's what I think is rational based on the evidence we have. I don't need to create fictitious intellectual genealogies or distracting gambling analogies, or get emotional. It just seems pretty clear to me from the Bible that for most of biblical history, Sinai was just not a thing in Israelite tradition. Exodus, for sure. Sinai, no. That doesn't mean the Exodus is true either, but it's a much more entrenched tradition.
For me, that presented an awesome intellectual challenge. My hands started to shake when I realized. And it made me realize the challenge of this world is not finding the truth.
Well, I guess that's good because I think you failed miserably there.
That's pretty obvious.
Not to most.
The challenge is having the courage to live with integrity after you know it. Thank you.
And how are you doing with that? I'd have to say I myself am not doing that great because as an Orthodox Jew, when I realized that arguments like Rabbi Kelemen just gave are absolute rubbish, and that this is the best that any Jewish apologist has come up with, it does become a challenge to live with integrity. So, let's review. Rabbi Kelemen sets out to prove that the Torah is true. He sets it up so that what he's really trying to prove is not the entire thing, but just the account of revelation in Deuteronomy. He never explicitly notes this narrowing of the focus, but fine, they all do that. Let's prove the entire Torah is true by looking at 3 verses. Whatever. So, how do you prove the revelation at Sinai actually happened as described in Deuteronomy? Rabbi Kelemen's first approach is that the claim of revelation cannot have been added into the tradition at a later date because there is no gap in Jewish intellectual history that would allow that to happen, and no identifiable charismatic cult leader to make it happen. But in fact, all of biblical history is a giant Jewish intellectual gap, and you don't need a charismatic cult leader. And if you did, there are at least 2 candidates that are explicitly mentioned in the Bible, and who knows how many others that aren't. So that's a big fail. His second approach is that the revelation at Sinai is just such a super-duper unique story that it must be true. And first of all, it's not so super-duper unique. A lot of ancient religions have gods interacting with people, and even if it was, that does not in any way demonstrate its truth. That just makes it a super-duper unique story. You can complain until you are blue in the face that if it was just a story, then everyone should be telling that story. It's just so super-duper good. But that still doesn't establish whether it's true or not. So, Rabbi Kelemen really said nothing that would shake my judgment that the Sinai story was added into the tradition at a date much later than the events it describes, which is probably true for most of the mythology in the Bible. But he did confirm my suspicion that Jewish apologetics is a fundamentally dishonest enterprise practiced by people who are smart and know better, but are willing to take a paycheck to tell gullible people what they want to hear. Fred would be proud. So yeah, bad apologetic. But let me finish on a different note. I think the Torah is a fascinating document. Inspiring, horrifying, and in many ways really unique and remarkable. But I wish we as Orthodox Jews could approach it in a rational way. Yes, this is our intellectual inheritance and our tradition, but it was not written by God. It was written by people, and that doesn't mean it's bad. It means we can expect to find bad and good. It has ideas about what it means to live a good life and a godly life, and I think those things are important. But I don't think we should be making up stories to try to convince people that God wrote the book if the evidence says otherwise. Intelligent people like Rabbi Kelemen who use dishonest means to press their case, well, I just think they should reconsider what they're doing. Okay, just a few more thoughts about Rabbi Kelemen's Sinai list. First, like I said, the post-biblical part is mostly just stupid, and I'm sorry he spent 2.5 years making it. There was a canonical Bible that entire time, so saying that, for example, Rashbam learned about Sinai from Rashi is dumb. They both learned about it from the canonical source. It's not an oral tradition at this point. It's like asking, who did you hear the U.S. Constitution from? Well, I heard it from Joe in 2023, and he heard it from Sandy in 1996, and she heard it from Brian in 1974. It's absurd. It's a canonical document. You all heard about it from the same place. The canonical document. That's the purpose of having a canonical document, so that you don't rely on, this is what I heard from this person, and this is what I heard from that person, and get into disputes over what the real version was, such as you find all over the Talmud or other oral traditions. So, the post-biblical tree is just stupid. I would only care who taught who if there was some novel teaching that was not standardized and widely publicized. For example, if Rabbi Kelemen received a tradition from his teacher that one is not permitted to eat chicken and soup together, I'd be curious what the intellectual lineage of that idea is. Who innovated it? And how did it get to Rabbi Kelemen? But if you tell me Rabbi Kelemen received a tradition that Moses hit a rock to obtain water, I don't care exactly who told him that. It's from the canonical source. So, again, stupid. And the biblical part is even stupider, I'm afraid. First, according to Rabbi Kelemen, there has always been a book, a canonical source, even during the biblical period. It's the Torah that Moses wrote. So the situation is really the same. It's not an oral tradition then either. So let's just try to actually picture this happening. You've got these three prophets, let's say Hosea, Amos, and Isaiah, who all overlap to some extent, and the impression we get is that Hosea was older than Amos, who was older than Isaiah. We don't know their actual birth dates and death dates, so it's all approximate. Let's say that Hosea was 20 years older than Amos. So Amos is 5 years old, Hosea is 25 years old, and what exactly do we imagine? Hosea takes a break from his prophetic activities to teach 5-year-old Amos what exactly? Deuteronomy chapter 4, word for word? Wouldn't it be far more likely that Amos would have learned this, if it existed, from his parents or someone in his village of Tekoa? Amos was not part of any prophetic school. He says he's not the disciple of a prophet. He was a shepherd before he got his prophetic calling. He makes that very clear in his book. So if a written Deuteronomy already existed and all the Jews were teaching this to their children, what are the chances that Hosea would have been the one to teach it to Amos? Was Hosea the local kindergarten teacher in Tekoa? Or did Rabbi Kelemen pick Hosea just because he's a famous personality? I thought,
we must be empiricists. We must link ourselves to the physical realities, to the evidence. We cannot suck theories out of our thumb. This could be true. That's irrelevant to me. What is in fact true? What do we know for sure is true?
and what difference would it make if Hosea was the local kindergarten teacher, if everyone was teaching from the same text of Deuteronomy anyway? What possible benefit does hearing it from Hosea have rather than hearing it from some other kindergarten teacher? Did Hosea have a better or more detailed story than Deuteronomy does? If so, then why doesn't Rabbi Kelemen have that version? Once you have a canonical document, the question of who told who is irrelevant. I mean, what really matters is who has custody of the document and how can its authenticity be assured. But if anything can be checked against the standard at any time, we don't care who told who what. Or does Rabbi Kelemen mean to say that Amos, despite being a prophet, never heard the story of Sinai until he met Hosea as an adult, either because everyone else had the wrong story or because there was no story? In this case, Hosea might have been the only person who could have taught Amos the right story because he was the only one who had the right story. But this leads to the next problem. Rabbi Kelemen says that this is his personal intellectual lineage. But actually, if that was true, it would be everyone's lineage. For example, how does he know his particular personal intellectual lineage is Hosea to Amos to Isaiah? Put aside the question of what these people taught each other, if they taught each other, and if they even knew each other. Why these people? I'm guessing there are not many choices of good guys from that era whose names we know. But this means that everyone's intellectual lineage is going to look exactly the same over a very long period of time. If this is the most plausible lineage that Rabbi Kelemen came up with based on these figures' biographies, it's fair to say it's also the most plausible lineage that you can come up with. Kelemen made his lineage, I can make my lineage, you can make your lineage, and they are all going to be exactly the same in the biblical era. This means that of everyone that Hosea taught, only Amos passed on the teaching. Of all the people Amos taught, only Isaiah passed on the teaching. That is what it means if every Jew alive today has the same intellectual lineage. There is no other path of instruction that leads to Jewish belief today. That's what Rabbi Kelemen's chart is telling us. If you can think of an alternative trajectory through the biblical period, then ask Rabbi Kelemen why he did not write down that lineage for himself.
We cannot suck theories out of our thumb. This could be true. That's irrelevant to me. What is in fact true? What do we know for sure is true?
There is no book on Rabbi Kelemen's bookshelf that tells him that the transmission of Hosea to Amos to Isaiah is his lineage and not your lineage. So that means we all have the same intellectual lineage for the Sinai revelation throughout the biblical period, according to Rabbi Kelemen. And this entirely contradicts the central tenet of Jewish apologetics that there is no single point of failure. The crucial thing all the apologists tell us is that from the very beginning, everyone saw the revelation and every parent passed the narrative down to their children throughout all time. But if everyone today presents the very same intellectual lineage, this means it's a single point of failure for hundreds and hundreds of years. If Amos fumbled the ball, it's cooked. If Pinchas didn't live 300 years, it's cooked. If Ezra got creative one day, it's cooked. If you want to talk about a crisis, that is a crisis. A single-file, person-to-person chain of the tradition for hundreds of years is the very opposite of what apologists like Rabbi Kelemen are always telling us. They tell us that Jewish belief is robust because it relies on thousands of people transmitting the tradition, parent to child. There's massive redundancy to protect against error, not like those other religions where someone could have made it all up. Well, that's all complete garbage according to Rabbi Kelemen's chart. Everyone, it turns out, has the same lineage, so there are more opportunities for error, fabrication, and innovation than those other religions, vastly more. You think you found a problem in Christianity because Paul of Tarsus could have made up the whole thing and everything traces back to him? Well, Rabbi Kelemen is giving us a religion that has at least 20 Pauls of Tarsus over hundreds of years. Thank you, Rabbi Kelemen. So, to conclude, either you are forced to believe that the Jewish tradition relies on a single point of failure system for hundreds of years, or that Rabbi Kelemen's intellectual lineage going back to Sinai is complete and utter garbage, a lie, a deceit, a fraud. I leave the choice to you.